as I said earlier, this is the ages and stages. We're really pleased to have Dr. Juliana Bloom join us tonight to provide us this presentation. Before we get started, I just want to give a couple of housekeeping announcements. This session is actually also simulcast in Spanish. So if you would like to access the session, you can go to the globe at the bottom of your Zoom panel and select the Spanish session. La sesión esta noche se transmitirá simultáneamente en español. Si desea acceder a la traducción en español, haga clic en el globo terráqueo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom y seleccione español. As a reminder, we are asking people to put their questions into the chat. You'll remain on mute for the whole session, but there is going to be time for questions throughout, so please put those into the chat. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can note that in the chat as well, and we'll be happy to have someone help you with that. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Juliana Bloom.
Hi, everybody. I'm so pleased to be here. Heather, can you see the screen okay? Does that look good?
I can, thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right. So we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about parenting a child with a bleeding disorder with a focus on infants, toddlers, and younger children before we hit the teenage and tween years. And what we're going to talk about a little bit is some general parenting information, and then we'll talk specifically about how all of that relates to what it's like to have a child with a bleeding disorder. So we're going to talk about developmental milestones, what's happening in terms of brain development, temperament, common mood behavior problems, some general parenting strategy. And at times it might seem like we spent a lot of time on general parenting, but it actually all comes together at the end when we talk specifically about parenting a child with a bleeding disorder. And we're going to spend some time on needle phobia. So we're going to talk specifically about 0 to 5 first. The really important thing that happens in 0 to 5 is attachment to a caregiver. It's just absolutely critical. It's foundational to all other development that is happening. And really, even though, a traditional family has a mother and a father and two parents, that kids don't actually need that in order to thrive. What we have found that research has shown us is that they need a strong attachment to at least one caregiver. Better to have strong attachment to one caregiver than poor attachment to two. What's important in this is that we are really a social species. Our brains are hardwired to connect to one another. And so much of the learning that we do happens through social means. So we know that poor attachment leads to lifelong mental health and health problems. And really in the beginning, all an infant needs is to know that its needs are going to be met by a caregiver, regularly, when they communicate, they get a response, they get their needs met, and that's what's important in the beginning. So the developmental milestones we're talking about: language, gross and fine motor skills, feeding and toileting, and social relationships. So this is an example of what happens in terms of brain development for the first 5 years of life. So you can see the sensory pathways, hearing and vision, those really develop pretty quickly. So by the time a child's 3 months old, their hearing and vision is pretty much what it's going to be for a lifetime, which is pretty amazing. And that makes sense because they are hardwired to look at a caregiver's face, and they're hardwired to start hearing language. Language really starts up pretty quickly as well. And by the time a child's 1 year old, they're really having that big language burst, and they continue to progress in those skills. What's interesting is if you look at it from the brain, this is happening from back to front. So the hearing and vision cortex is in the back of your brain. The language centers are in the back of your brain. But these other centers, the higher cognitive functions, like maybe spatial reasoning, are more halfway, more halfway to the front of the brain. And things like self-regulation, that really continues to develop into adulthood, although a decent amount of it is present by the age of 5. So also in terms of size, there's a huge difference in terms of what you end up with. So at birth, the brain is about 25% of the size it's going to be at adulthood. And by the age of 5, it's 90% of that size. So there is another 10%, and that 10% is very important, but so much happens from 0 to 5 that is very critical and important for kids. So not, so we talked about 90%. So the basic motor and sensory skills are pretty hardwired in there. But if you look at this, what you see here is that red and yellow are kind of undeveloped. And as we move towards blue, this is more developed in terms of what the cortex looks like, how mature it is. And at 5 years, you've got a lot of great growth, but it's not that mature in terms of the content of it. Over time, as you move on, by the age of 10, you can see here that the back part of the brain, where we have language, where we have vision and hearing, where we have spatial skills, that's pretty set. It's pretty done developing by the age of 10. But the frontal lobes, those really need those extra years to develop more. And what do the frontal lobes do? They do things like they do executive functioning. So they do things along the lines of planning, organizing, paying attention, regulating your emotions and behaviors, switching. So if you're trying something and it doesn't work, your brain has to make the switch from one thing to another. All right, so what's important to realize is that even though the brain is 90% developed, that 10% is critical because it is all about those executive functions. So children are not just little adults. They're missing some very critical skills. By the time they're 5 or 10, you look at them and you think, okay, well, you're mostly a person at this point, but there's an awful lot that is still to be developed. And it's very important for us as parents to recognize that they are not done. And so sometimes if they make a choice that you think is a poor choice and might objectively be a poor choice, it's important to think about that as something that is still developmentally appropriate rather than my kid was just behaving bad. The way to think about it is my child is still working on this skill of so if you have a complete meltdown in your house over something that seems not so important to you, you have to remember that they're still working on developing those emotional regulation skills. And you should be helping them do it as opposed to being upset at them for not having it complete already. So some ways that they are different is from 6 to 10, children this age still think very, very concretely. So for example, if you ask a child this age, 6 to 10, is it okay to steal medicine to save the life of someone that you love? And at that age, a 10-year-old will say, no, it's not. Stealing is wrong. And they just think very, very black and white concretely about it. Once you hit the teenage years, they start to recognize that there are shades of gray and that sometimes you can do things that are bad, such as lie or steal, for a good purpose. So for example, a young child, when asked, how do I look in this outfit, might give you a really honest answer, whereas it might be kind of nice to have a less honest answer, so that you introduce the concept of a polite lie or a white lie, things like that. At that age too, at the age 0 to 10, they're very focused on what's real rather than abstract concepts. So even when you see their work in math or language arts, it's not about big pictures and abstractions. It's really about what's concrete, what's happening in front of you. What's important is that parents really often overestimate the ability of kids this age to make good decisions. So they tend to think that there are behavior problems instead of there being a lack of executive functioning skills, which is normative and appropriate. And of course, ADHD, which is very common, we've got about 8% of kids in this country who have ADHD. Those kids are going to have even more impairment in executive function. That's actually what's diagnostic about ADHD. 6 to 10, I've said many times that I felt very lucky that my kids were in this period when the pandemic hit, because I had one that was 7 and one that was 10, and everything was kind of quiet at that point. There's not a lot happening in terms of big developmental leaps. But everything, they're still progressing, they're growing in their skills, they're trying to do the same things, but increasing complexity. So 5-year-olds can run really well, but between the age of 6 and 10, you might see kids trying their hands at more complicated sports, more complicated motor patterns, more complicated books, more complicated art. You see a big increase in this time in independence and the complexity of their language skills, their motor skills, both fine motor, doing stuff with your hands. This is the age that kids might be capable of doing some simple cooking, for example, but they're not nearly as interested in it as they were when they were 3 and flour got all over the place. Peer relationships do become a bit more complex. I had the privilege of getting to visit a preschool class yesterday, and I saw a bunch of 4-year-olds, and I was reminded just how delightful 4-year-olds are because they just love everybody. Everybody in that classroom of 15 were friends, and they genuinely believe that. But, between the ages of 6 and 10, the kids do differentiate more. They do it by gender, they do it by interest, they do it by race, social class, whatever, and that's unfortunate. But at this age, the parents are still their primary attachment, or whoever their caregiver is, grandparent, whoever they live with in the home. And there's not as much of a focus on peers as you would have in the teen years. The age of reason, as we call it, is when kids go from being really irrational to having rational thinking, and that's around age 7. So, for example, a child, if you're not serving their favorite food for dinner, they might have a complete and total meltdown, even though you say, well, we're going to have that. We're having tacos tomorrow. We don't get to have tacos tonight. You might still get that irrational, upset, but I want tacos now kind of behavior from a 6-year-old. And around 7, you usually start to say, okay, I can handle this. I can handle this disappointment. I'm going to be okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is temperament. This is really fascinating area of research from my perspective. So temperament, there are 9 scales that are biologically hardwired ways of interacting with the world that children are born with, and has been documented by research and is cross-cultural. It's just absolutely true about humanity. So this is very old research. We're now moving on 50 years old, but it's borne up over these 5 decades. And the different dimensions of activity of temperament are activity level, which I think you guys all understand what that is. Rhythmicity, that's how regularly you're hungry, you're tired, how much of a pattern you tend to have every single day. And if anybody's ever had a newborn who did not have good rhythmicity, you know how difficult that is. Distractibility, approach withdrawal, meaning how do you react to a new object or a new person? Are you willing to approach that new object or new person, or do you shy away and hold back until you feel more confident and secure? And that's a temperament that really sticks with you through life. Adaptability is how do you react to change, basically? How are you with change? And some people just are biologically hardwired that they have a really hard time with it, and some do pretty well with that. You might hear about transitions. How well does your child transition? Attention span and persistence, how much time you might devote to an activity before giving up on that activity. And even though children in general, they have an attention span that is much less than adults. And adults, by the way, our attention span is maximum about 43 minutes. So adult attention span is not what we think it is. And children, certainly when they're preschoolers, maybe 10, 15 minutes tops. And it gradually grows over the lifespan. But there are some people who are born with just a stick-to-itiveness, like a persistence that is not the same as other people. The other thing is intensity of reaction. So some people, everything is the best or everything is the worst. And some people are just more mellow, even-keeled, no big highs, no big lows. So that's kind of intensity of reaction. Another thing is, how intense does a stimulus have to be to make you respond to something. So if I pinch you very little bit, does that make you jump? Or do I have to pinch you really hard before you jump? And then the quality of mood. There are temperaments for this. Some people are just born a little bit more joyful and friendly, and some people are just more of a negative affect that they're born with. So you put all of this together, and I'm sure all of you are having fun right now thinking of where your own kids fall in these dimensions. Um, so you put them together and you get some categories. So the easy child is just happy by nature, regular rhythms, accepts new situations um, easily. And that's about 40% of kids. So that's wonderful. The difficult child is about 10% of kids. And if you have one of those, those kids are just kind of born irritable, irregular biological rhythms, very intense response to new situations. And then there's the slow to warm up child, which is about 15%. And I had one of those, and it was very eye opening to watch. And no one believes me now that he was incredibly shy, but he was. And then 35% don't fit into any category. They, go between, or they have some dimensions of one and some of another. But isn't it wonderful that 40% of kids are so easy? So temperament is not personality. Those are different. Personality really, honestly, isn't stable until 30. But the temperament interacts with your environment over time to form your personality. And we know that for adults, there's 5 dimensions: conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, which is kind of like worry and need to have things controlled and rigid, openness, and if you're introverted or extroverted, which you can, of course, be a combination of. So those 5 traits together kind of put together your personality. What's important to think about when you have a child is, how is that child stimulating you? So what can happen is, let's say you have a difficult baby, a baby who's in that 10%. Well, mom comes home from work, picks up the baby and gets a negative reaction. If that happens over and over and over again, eventually mom is not going to smile and be happy to see the baby, because she's more stressed out. Dad's more stressed out. There's less positive interactions in general with a child. And then that turns more into behavior problems, and you get kind of a negative spiral. So having acceptance of your child's negative moments, and even if your child's not difficult, just in general, having acceptance of negative emotions and being very consistent and even and pleasant yourself can move you out of that spiral. But it's just important to realize that how does the child interact with you? Every time I have a child come in my office that I'm evaluating, I stop and I ask myself the question, how do I interact with this child? How do I respond to this child? What does this child elicit in me? And that's an important thing to recognize. So in terms of with young children, preventing mood and behavior problems, the big thing, I think, and I learned this from a wonderful early educator in my community named Karen Duncan. I'm in Orlando, Florida, by the way. Something called the 3 C's. So the 3 C's are connect with your child, communicate, and contribute. And those are her 3 C's, and I think they're wonderful. We really know that connection, or lack of connection, can be a huge factor behind behavior problems. So children aren't connecting with you and they will act out. And sometimes it's very difficult to get, that real one-on-one time with a person with our busy schedules and busy lives. There's not that much time to actually connect and interact between work and school and homework and dinner and walking the dog, or, whatever it is you're doing. In general, when I have a family come in who's having behavior problems with a child, the very first thing I ask them to do is to have 15 minutes of special time with that child's day. Now, what that means is there can't be a device involved, no screen. It has to be a child-led activity, something that you do together that you hopefully both enjoy. For like 3, 4-year-olds, it's often like imaginative play or building a tower with blocks. And during that time, the parent doesn't teach anything, and the parent doesn't ask any questions. The parent just comments. So if you're building a tower of blocks with your 3-year-old, You just say, oh, you put the green block on the red block. That's all you say. You're just seeing them. That's all you do in that time. And that actually is a huge connection. That's a huge way to connect. And behavior problems will decrease by about 50% just by doing special time. And it's particularly recommended for people who, for kids who have behavior problems. That's the first place to start. It seems like a strange place to start with behavior problems, but it works almost all the time. And it's just in general, even if your kid is not having behavior problems, it's a good way to parent is to make sure that you fill up that cup of your attention only 15 minutes once a day. Undivided attention for 15 minutes is much better than divided attention for an hour. So I try to do it. It can be hard, but I have found that as my kids have gotten older, playing games with them is a good way to do it, or taking the dog for a walk and just talking, something like that, just so that they feel like they're heard and they have your attention, even if they don't want your advice on something. They don't want you to problem solve for them or care for them. They just want your attention. They just want to be heard and seen. The other thing is we want to think about how we communicate with kids this age. One thing that makes me crazy is when I hear parents say, is it time to go potty? Well, is it? The kid can say no. Or do you want me to change your diaper? Well, the answer to that for any kid 18 months and older is going to be no. No, the way to put it is you do want to be polite, but you want to be clear and you want to say what it is that you need, and not assume that the kid knows. So, like you might walk into a room and say, this room is a mess. And the kid will go, uh-huh. Yeah, you saw me. I appreciate that, you know? Whereas what you need to say is, it's time to clean up your room. That will get the message across. And then with a kid this age, you also need to be very descriptive about what it is. So you want to be clear, but you want to be polite because your child will start to say exactly what you say. So, they will repeat the way that you speak to them, especially when it comes to commands. So that's a great opportunity to put in the pleases and the thank yous and when you're giving those commands. The other thing, it seems kind of crazy, kind of, um, it's not very intuitive, is that kids do a lot better in terms of behavior problems and their mood when they are doing chores. Now, you would think, of course, they would much rather be playing or drawing or watching TV. Of course they would. But when they feel like they're contributing to the family and they're building useful skills, and of course, in the beginning, it's not going to be useful at all, but it does make them feel more invested in the family and in that family community that they're in. So, right now I'm dealing with this with my son, whose job it is to unload the dishwasher. And sometimes I find things in the most ridiculous places, but I just put it back where it goes and I say thank you. And I'm grateful that that job is getting done. So you guys have probably all seen this. People think this is kind of crazy, but 50 years ago, this is what kids did do. So this isn't there to say, hey, your kid should be doing this, because most modern kids do not do the number of chores. I mean, to be honest, most adults don't do the number of chores that are on this list. We're busy, our lives are busier than ever and our houses are messier than ever. And really that's fine. But these are things that they can do. With supervision. They can't be expected to do it alone, and it would be faster to do it yourself. But taking the time to teach them how to do these things for themselves really builds their self-confidence and is very important. Okay. The other things that have been associated in the research with lower incidences of mood and behavior and problems, and actually a lot more academic success, are family dinners. That's probably the number one, over and over and over again. The other thing you'd be surprised about is that the amount of time that is spent outdoors and is spent exercising for kids is associated with higher academics and with preventing mood and behavior problems, lower levels of mood and behavior problems. Having fun with your child. Sometimes we're also busy, it can forget what that feels like, but doing something that you enjoy and introducing your child to it is a huge way of connecting with your child and then preventing problems. Another thing that, of course, I'm a child psychologist, I'm very big on this, is what we call emotional literacy and validation. And so that just means from the time they are very young, 1 or 2, you start talking to them about feelings. Feelings are something that exists. You feel them in your body and they affect your mood and they affect your behavior. So when your child throws something, you say, "Ooh, I can tell you feel really frustrated. Oh, I'd be really frustrated if my brother took my toy too." That doesn't mean that you're saying that the behavior is okay. You're just labeling it. That's the first step, because later on, you're able to say, well, when you're angry, what are some things you can do to calm yourself down? And that's how you build those emotional regulation and executive functioning skills. Being able to identify the emotions is the first step towards that. So, one of the first activities we do in child therapy is assessing, okay, do these kids actually know all their emotions? And many of the times they don't. So we start there and we start with naming it. Sometimes you need to name it to tame it. Even just saying, I'm feeling worried, that takes you out of yourself and lets you deal with what the worry is. Okay, so another piece is sleep hygiene, which I think I'm going to talk about a little bit more as we go on. But this is something that is a major problem for a lot of families with our busy lives and technology. But making sure that you have a good bedtime routine. For kids this age, you don't have to worry so much about caffeine products, but for teenagers, you do. Making sure that you do the same thing every night as you're falling asleep, because that'll classically condition your brain and body to fall asleep at the right time, and being on a pretty regular schedule in terms of time that you fall asleep and time that you wake up. Not, I was just counseling a 5-year old who had a very bad day at school and find out that over the weekend, the parents let him stay up till 11 o'clock at night. And because they were entertaining and they didn't want to stop to put him to bed. But I explained to them, they said, but it doesn't matter because he can sleep late the next day. No, he's still operating at a sleep deficit, because most of us who are parents know you can put your kid to bed at whatever time, but they're not going to sleep the equivalent later. And that's not good for your brain. That rhythmicity is really important. And also limiting screens, no screens an hour before bedtime, and ideally no screens in the bedroom is really important for sleep hygiene, because screens produce blue light that goes right into your eye and right into a part of your brain that makes the melatonin. And the melatonin is the hormone that makes you sleepy and lets you fall asleep. And the blue light from any screen will inhibit the production of melatonin and keep you awake. So it's not that screens are so bad in general, but you just should not have them within the hour before bedtime. You should have a screen-free sleep hygiene routine. Other things in sleep hygiene are like a nice cool bedroom, things like that can be very important. What we did for my kids, and I think is important generally as you're introducing technology, laptops, phones, iPads, whatever, is you have a technology contract where you talk about how you're going to care for the device, what your responsibilities are, what you are allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do on the device, and then what happens if you see something pops up that shouldn't pop up, and talking about all of that and working that through, I think is really important. Okay, so routines, I think are, as we've talked about, I think are very important. When your kids are very young, it's good to have like a graphic like this. So you have a morning routine where you say, these are all the things we do in the day, and you have pictures of them because your child is not reading yet. As time goes on, you can graduate to a little sticky note that has a list of things they can do once your child's a confident reader. Eventually, your child will be making her own sticky notes and putting them up, which is where we are right now. And you just remind them to follow the plan. And I think that you really need a morning routine for getting out the door. I think you need an afternoon routine for coming home. This is about, you take off your shoes, you put away your backpack, whatever it is that needs to get done. And then a bedtime routine. And you do those things consistently, and kids really thrive on that structure and routine. In general, the routines that we talked about, the start behaviors like getting ready for school, that requires more work than dealing with stop behaviors. So things like sticker charts, those picture graphs that we said provide that structure. It's also really great to sing songs, to make it funny, Daniel Tiger has some great songs at this age, and you can have a thing where if you're ready to get out the door by a certain time, you get a sticker on a sticker chart, and then you can pick a prize at the end of the week. So that's very helpful. Stop behaviors are things that you need them to stop doing, such as hitting, screaming, tantrums. Those are stop behaviors. So for stop behavior, you have a couple of options, including timeout, removing a toy or a privilege, and something, you wouldn't do this with hitting, but if they're whining, for example, you can count that 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3 Magic is a great program. They have online videos, they have books, just in terms of counting those behaviors. And you have to combine that with some emotional validation. I see that you're really frustrated. Hitting is not okay. I need you to, you're going to go to timeout. And then when you're done, we'll talk about what happened. Why did you get so upset? What can you do next time so that you're not so upset? So you're using both that validation strategy and also the stop behavior. It's important to remember to avoid the big splash. So I'm putting here as a contrast Miranda Priestley, who is cool as a cucumber, and in my opinion, so much more terrifying than Gaston, who was kind of a buffoon. Gaston had big reactions to everything. Miranda Priestley was quiet and very contained and very cool, and people listened to her better than they did to Gaston. My point is this, is you don't want to do what we call the big splash. So sometimes kids are testing you out and they want to see, okay, if I throw the rock in the pond, how big is the splash going to be? Meaning, if I hit my sister, is my mom or dad going to notice? And if you yell and scream, that they're going to realize that they can really get your goat. They can make you have a big reaction. Whereas if you come over to a child who's just hit their sibling, pick them up, put them into timeout, set an alarm, and then talk to them about it when they're done, they're not going to get that big of a splash. Okay, so from the ages of 3 to 6, but it can be beyond, there's a lot of fears. Nightmares, and their imaginations are taking off. It's such an amazing time for what they can do, but a lot of that creeps over into having excessive imagination, which falls into nightmares. Kids are often afraid of water, they're afraid of dogs, they're afraid of bugs. What you want to do in that case is you want to model calm, not be afraid of that same thing. And you want to gradually expose them to the thing that they're scared of. And this is going to come up a lot as we talk about needle phobia. Okay, so systematic desensitization is, for example, if you had a kid who was afraid of water, first you would put them in the bathtub with it empty, turn the water on, and let them touch the water. That's all they have to do that night. The next night they go in with an inch, and you keep raising the stakes every single night so they're exposed to more and more water until eventually they're taking a bath like normal. It's important that you expose them to what they're scared of without overwhelming them. And you have to remain calm the whole time, and even better if you can make it silly and fun. That works great with that age. So we talked a bit about what happens when you have defiance and aggression. Even though it is counterintuitive, we often start with special time. And you want to validate their feelings, provide them with an alternative, 2 choices that are both acceptable to you. I understand you're so frustrated because you can't have tacos tonight. We're having chicken tonight. Would you like milk or water to drink? That's an example of how you validate the feelings. You don't give in. They're not running your household, but you do give them a choice which is acceptable to you, milk or water. And that helps switch them into be like, okay, I do get some control. Makes them feel good. The 2 kinds of tantrums are kind of a full emotional meltdown where the kid has just lost it. This is a hungry, tired kid who has had too much and is just needs comfort and to calm down. They just exploded. The other kind of tantrum is tyrannical tantrum, which is where they want to be king and they want to be in charge, and they're upset that they don't get to rule the world. They don't get to control things. And you need to respond to those 2 tantrums in different ways. And all parents will get it wrong at some point and think that and mix them up. So the emotional meltdown, you want to comfort them and help fix what is the underlying problem. Are you hungry? Are you tired? The tyrannical tantrum you want to ignore. because they're just trying to control you and try to manipulate you into getting what you want. No one wins when that happens. One thing that's important to realize is the kids who need the most love often ask for it in the most unloving ways. And that's really important to talk to understand. So for anxiety and depression, it's important to realize that our diagnosis rate is really skyrocketing. We've been giving the same questionnaires since the 50s, and we've seen a basically continuous increase where there's more anxiety and depression 5 to 8 times what it was in the 50s. We've also seen the suicide rate double in teenagers and young adults. And we've seen on the same questionnaires a decline in empathy and a rise in narcissism. So what's important here is that, and that was all before the pandemic even happened. And we know the pandemic has been incredibly hard on kids. Just opening the chat. Okay, just seeing if there's anything I need to know. So overall, 22% said that there was worsening of their child's mental or emotional health. We saw more depression. We saw more anxiety, we saw more stress, very, very significantly in young children from that time period. So why is it going up overall? And there's a strong case to be made from Dr. Gray talking about here that free play is something that really leads to a decline in anxiety, depression, builds kids' executive skills. They get exercise at the same time. They learn cooperation. This is free play. This is not flag football where everyone is coaching what the kid is doing. This is kids running around on a playground or running around in their neighborhood or making up their own games. And what we know is that the kind of helicopter or lawnmower parenting that is so prevalent in America right now is associated with decreased self-esteem and increased anxiety. Because if the parent's doing everything for you, you don't get the sense that you can do things for yourself and you don't feel good about yourself. So this is why it is actually really important to let kids fail sometimes. And you want to think about yourself instead of being a lawnmower where you're brushing away everything that is difficult for your child. You want to think about yourself as a gardener. You have a seed, you put it in the soil, you water it, you expose it to sunlight, you prune away the weeds. But generally, whatever that seed is what that kid is going to become. And we don't control that as parents. You might be growing a daisy, you might be growing an onion, you might be growing lettuce. You don't know what you're growing, but it's not your job. You're not going to be able to shape it. Your job is just to let it be the best possible plant that it can be. So we talked about how children are not miniature adults. It's normal to understand that they are messy, impatient, and loud. They're active, they're easily distracted, they act without thinking. There are some kids who are particularly adventurous. That's not necessarily pathology. So the next thing we're going to talk about is mindset. And there's two different kinds of mindset that are important to think about: growth mindset or fixed mindset. In the growth mindset, you are okay with frustration and failure. You see it as part of the learning process. And a fixed mindset, you say, if I'm not good at that, I don't even want to try it. I give up when I'm frustrated. I don't like to be challenged. And we actually know that telling kids that they are smart leads to a fixed mindset. If there's one thing I could ask you guys to not say to your child, it's to say that you are smart. I would really want you to say, I see you work really hard, and I see that you are really not giving up on that problem. That's really fantastic. So these are some things that you can say in terms of growth mindset instead of, I just can't do this. I'm going to train my brain. And if you're upset, like my friend can do something and I can't do it, you say, okay, well, what are you going to learn? Are you going to learn something from them? So it's important to realize that if that failure is part of the success process. Anybody who's been incredibly successful has had failures. It is not that we are glorifying failure. It is that we are saying that failure is normative and part of the process, and our response to failure should be to get up and try again, as opposed to give up, because many kids just give up the first time that they fail. So the ways that you can kind of promote a growth mindset for your child is to talk about your learning, talk about your brain. What mistake did you make today? Did that teach you something? What did you try it really hard today? And you make comments like, I like how you tried all sorts of strategies. I like how you didn't give up. And you want to give feedback. So people say, I'm not allowed to tell my kid they're smart. I mean, occasionally, but not for the most part. But you give feedback on process. So you think things like, wow, you really came up with a lot of different solutions. Or I love to see you set that goal. And I bet you're going to meet it next week. Or I know how you're working so hard. But if you praise personal characteristics like being smart, pretty, or artistic, it will actually lead to a loss of confidence in your child. You want to praise how hard they work. So these are some of my favorite books. I love these, and I think I also emailed Heather some additional ones that I think are fantastic that she's going to be able to have you guys access. Okay. So in general, if your kid has a bleeding disorder or any sort of chronic health condition, they're more at risk, I think quite understandably, of having health anxiety and experiencing something we call medical traumatic stress. They're also really at risk for parental overprotectiveness, which can increase their anxiety and lower their self-esteem. Now, of course, you have to pay attention to their bleeding disorder. You have to protect them. There are limitations, there are treatments. This is part of their life. But the goal is to find a balance with your need to protect your child with your child's need to be independent, and find that goal in a way that feels safe and comfortable. So medical traumatic stress is what happens when you've been exposed to a lot of medical situations. Sometimes it leads to what is kind of a low grade post-traumatic stress disorder. And we actually talk about this as traumatic stress, not necessarily PTSD, full-blown PTSD, but having some of these same symptoms. So when there has been trauma, you often experiencing the same three symptoms, re-experiencing, avoiding the thing that makes you nervous, and kind of being hyper arousal, meaning that you are just jittery or easily startled, particularly around certain issues. So for young kids, the parents are actually more affected by the medical traumatic stress because this is on you. You're the one who is dealing with this on a daily basis, trying to protect your child who at some point is too young to have an idea of what's happening. But older kids can grow into that trauma response. So I've seen kids who, for example, had cancer when they were very, very young. They're now 13, 14, 15 coming into clinic being like, what happened to me? Like they didn't realize it when they were that young. But now they're like, holy cow, tell me about this. Let's talk about this. I'm very upset. I'm having nightmares about it. It's when their brains were ready to understand it that they actually started to have the trauma response. Very young kids tend to focus on procedures. That's what's upsetting to them. The big picture, having a bleeding disorder isn't upset to a very young child. What's upsetting to them is the needle. So what's important in general is to focus on, so understand that there's a traumatic stress response. You want to talk about the feelings that are happening. You want to figure out if their worries are realistic. You want to focus on, you want to focus on what you can control, what helps your child feel safe. And you want to directly teach some coping skills like deep breathing or prayer or meditation, or there's great meditations online that you can listen to, or distraction techniques. So in general, when you have some needle phobia, it's the most important thing that you can do is model calm for your child. If you are upset, they will be upset. If you are calm, they will be more calm. They might not be completely calm because they're distressed, but anything that you do to show you're upset is going to make it worse for your child. In general, I don't think it's a problem for parents to have negative emotions in front of their kids as long as they handle them well. But when you're dealing with a needle phobia situation, you need to do an infusion. That is something where you just want to be really calm during that time. You also want to be doing something called previewing, which is where you talk about or read a book about or look at a video about what's going to happen before you do it, so the child knows what to expect. A lot of the reason kids have fears is because of that incredible imagination, and they're imagining worse things that are going to happen than what actually happens. Another thing, kids do a lot of working out their emotions through play. So definitely practicing doing the infusion on the toys, using a doctor's kit, them having a doctor's kit. It gives them some control. And then the other thing is back to this routines, kids do so well setting up a routine. So depending on what your schedule is, and depending on how significant your child's needle phobia is, if your child has needle phobia, it might be good to do the whole routine of the infusion every single day, but only do the needle stick on some days. And just kind of desensitizes it to them. So you go through, you sit and you put on some music, you put them in the chair, you clean off the area, you do the whole thing, but only on some days do you do the needle stick. Also, this is an exceptional situation for your child. You can bribe them. It's not a problem. A psychologist told you, okay? If you want to say you get a lollipop after you do this, that is no problem whatsoever. You want to say you get to watch a show while you do this? Absolutely. You are going through an exceptional medical situation, and there's no harm in that. Also, if they're just really having a meltdown, you might need to just ignore it and walk away and try again at another time. You definitely don't want to engage in the big splash in that moment. And I know that's very emotional and you're all keyed up, but that's an important piece of it. So I will say that we have the process of independence for folks in the bleeding disorder community does move very slowly, but there are particular stages that we work through. So I think that was a repeat. These are the guidelines from the Medical and Scientific Advisory Council from the National Hemophilia Foundation, and that's another resource that Heather is going to share with you all. And for these different age groups, 0 to 4, 5 to 8, 9 to 12, there are guidelines for what your child should be doing independently or what you should be working toward during that time frame in the categories of getting social support, health and lifestyle habits, education, and then moving into vocational and financial planning, self-advocacy, and independent healthcare behaviors. And you want to gradually over time transition the knowledge and caregiving of the bleeding disorder to your offspring over time. It's a slow process, but is one that needs to keep moving forward, and that's important. And camp is so great for this in terms of it provides peer pressure for your child to develop some of these independent skills. So when do you know if you need mental health treatment? You can do it just if you want support. Just having a child with a bleeding disorder in 2021 is a huge challenge in and of itself. And you are welcome to do this just because you need support and to talk through parenting with someone else. But particularly you want to do it if your child's mood or behavior is interfering with treatment, interfering with their school or their family life or their social life. If your child seems really tired, irritable, or worried, those are times that you want to do the mental health treatment. And so in terms of therapy, it does help, but just don't wait too long. Early intervention is really key. The earlier that we can work on these problems and change some of these thoughts and behaviors, the better they're going to develop, the more resilient, the more independent they're going to be. You can look for a licensed mental health counselor or a licensed psychologist, and you might get referrals from your pediatrician or your hematologist. APA has a locator. There's also something called Psychology Today. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that if there's an emergency, a lot of people don't know what to do if their child becomes suicidal or violent. You call 911 or you bring them to an ER. I would recommend bringing them to an ER if you possibly can, ideally at a dedicated children's hospital as opposed to an adult hospital would be my recommendation. And then these are the references, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bloom. That was a really fantastic presentation. We do have a couple of questions that came in through the chat, so I'm going to share those. We have about 5 minutes before the presentation ends. So one of the questions was, how can a parent of a child with a bleeding disorder be sure not to make their unaffected sibling feel left out?
And I had to cut a slide about siblings for time. So for example, I mean, it depends on the age of the siblings, right? But for example, you know how we talked about setting up that routine and doing that every day, and they get a treat and they sit in the chair. You can set up a routine for your unaffected sibling as well and make them feel like they're in this together. You can give the unaffected sibling a role in the healthcare of your child, even if it's something as simple as go get the lovey from the bedroom so that we can hold on to it right now. But in general, there's a lot of resources and services available for siblings. A lot of children's hospitals have sibling support times, and also doing that special time with your unaffected child will reduce a lot of behaviors.
Great, thank you. Another question is, do you have some strategies for working with a 5-year-old who takes out his frustration in physical ways on his 4-year-old sister?
So that's a pretty common situation. A lot of what I talked about is going to be helpful. Doing first and foremost that special time with the 5-year-old so that child's bucket is filled up. They feel like they're getting enough attention. Using feelings words with them a lot. There's some great books about anger and hitting that I would definitely make part of the routine. But if the 5-year-old is frustrated and hitting the 4-year-old, the 5-year-old needs to be removed every time that happens from the 4-year-old. So just a simple timeout, you put them against a wall in the main room for 5 minutes, you set a timer, and then when they've sat that out, then you can talk to them about it. Timeout can be more complicated than that, so I do recommend looking at the 1-2-3 magic book because not every kid sits there nicely. But the 1-2-3 magic book would be where I would go for that particular case.
Excellent. Thank you. If there's any other questions remaining, please do put those into the chat. As we put and noticed earlier, we will be able to post the recording of this session as well as the references and resources that Dr. Bloom had mentioned earlier on our website tomorrow. And I just want to also say that at the end of this webinar, you will automatically receive a evaluation. It goes into into your browser. So don't expect it to pop up on this screen, but in your browser. And if you complete that evaluation and add your name to it, you'll be included in the daily drawing of our prize. I also wanted to say that Dr. Bloom is presenting on teenage year, tweens and teens, in fact, later on during symposium next week. So if you are interested and have children that fall within that age range and would like to hear Dr. Bloom speak again, I would highly encourage you to check that presentation out. You can find all the information and details on the symposium website. So thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, and I look forward to sharing resources with everyone again tomorrow.
Thank you all for attending and to HFA for having me. I always love being a part of this wonderful community.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.